The thing about interviewing Saylor is everyone wants to interview Saylor. And I think a lot of the time, because like he's a great interview, but you're going to get good downloads, right? And so every time we get one, we always think about it quite deeply in terms of what do we want to get out of this? Like he does a lot of 2-hour why Bitcoin shows and zinger, zinger, zinger. There's no second best, but we don't want to do those because they're done. We want to spark a debate and get into good subjects. And I felt like with this one, I don't think he's done an interview like this for a while.
I don't think I've ever seen him talk about this.
Yeah, getting into something. And it sparked a lot of debate and discussion. I mean, it's still being discussed on Twitter today, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some big subjects at the moment, but I found myself agreeing with his principle and disagreeing with his metaphors.
He makes good metaphors too.
Some, yeah.
I think that the particularly the one about the building systems engineers and for an airplane, of thinking about all the different things that go into it, and not just one part. And so I thought that was a good analogy. He's a lot. He's himself. He's like an aeronautical engineer, right? Like he's an aerospace engineer, I believe. And so when he's
rocket scientist,
so way smarter than you or I. But we were talking about 1 through 9. Those are good numbers. I was kind of like, I don't know where you're going with this.
Yeah,
but I tracked on the airplane. So
yeah, it's a challenge as an interview as well, because I kind of went toe to toe with him at one point. Which, if you go toe to toe with Saylor and you get it wrong, he's going to run rings around you. But I felt it was like a healthy amount of pushback. But I came out agreeing with him. It's a bit like when the block size wars happened, right? I was pretty fresh and green in Bitcoin.
I was as well.
Yeah, and I was kind of like, oh, I understand the argument about big blocks. That makes sense. That we don't want high transaction fees. And then I was like, oh, but these small blocks make sense. If you have small blocks, we can protect decentralization, which is what we want. I ended up siding with the small block people, but I can see a world where I didn't, and some people didn't. Wences didn't. Eric Voorhees didn't. And so I can see how that could happen. But at the time, it didn't mean too much to me because I'm not that invested. I've just started a podcast. Had I even started the podcast there? Maybe I hadn't.
I think you had.
He had a small amount of Bitcoin. Now it's like my whole fucking life. Like if that happened now, this would be a big deal for me. I'd be worried. My net wealth's tied up in there. My career's tied up in there.
Yeah, it's extremely personal. And again, just unintended consequences of the last change, and whether they were unintended or not, they've certainly had consequences, at least in the interim. And I think they will prove to be just a short term, kind of not necessarily even breaking an incentive, just something that was unintended and that now is having consequences to any number of people that are trying to pursue real economic transactions. And my perspective on that is, well, the consensus rules are the consensus rules. Now, there were changes that allowed this to happen, but we should certainly consider those type of past changes and their potential impacts, because even if somebody is sitting there saying, well, if we make this change, that's a worthwhile trade-off, but they're not considering whether it's a worthwhile trade-off for all the different range of stakeholders, and that this is, to me personally, certainly the most important project in the world. And realistically, for what it can mean, I think that it's the most important project for the world. So that if you're thinking about it like, well, I want my change and my change shouldn't impact you, it's really upon you to prove to everybody else that it's also good for you, or at the very least not bad. And so the one thing that I was, I think you did push back on it a little bit, but the question of like, would he have said Lightning, the changes that allowed Lightning were good changes? Because he seemed to intimate that, well, those resulted in less fees, and that's not necessarily my view. My view is that if you make Bitcoin a better utility, it's actually going to drive more demand for Bitcoin. More on-chain transactions are derived from more Lightning transactions, not less. It's just shifting. Like if I was going to sell a book for $30, I can't do that on-chain. Some people do, but most times it's not viable. So are those transactions just not supposed to happen in Bitcoin, or could I do 10 transactions on Lightning and then settle on chain? Where it's like, it wasn't clear to me whether what he was saying was like any change that changes economics or shouldn't happen, or just whether or not they should be overwhelmingly viewed as a consensus before they happen.
Yeah, so he seemed to be okay with any kind of defense bugs, security updates. I think the kind of changes that come, the regular bug updates.
Yeah, but I don't know, like if the changes that allowed Lightning, I don't know if...
It was protocol level that I think he was most concerned with. I actually went early in the segue. I think I started at BIP 16. I said, well, that gave us multi-sig. And then I think it was BIP 66, I think I brought up, and SegWit, and I talked about transaction malleability, and I talked about then SegWit, and that's where he brought up the point that the miners at that point had low income, and it was infringing on their property rights. But as I believe, SegWit was miner signaled, right? And so it was a free market that decided for it. But I think what it comes down to is, and a few people have accused him on Twitter of being ultra conservative because he's got such huge bags, he wants to protect them. And I think that's the point. You do the more you've got to lose, the more conservative you be, and I'm more conservative. And
but I don't think the point of just how much money he has, it's because if you have the majority of your savings in Bitcoin, it's just as personal to you. So you should, whether it's $100,000 or multiple billion, what it means to you as a percentage of your worth becomes, should dictate, I would say, your perspective on the degree of conservatism.
I think we're making the same point.
Yeah.
I've also got big bags. Somebody like who has 100,000, to them that might be big bags. What I'm saying is, to you as an individual, the more it means to you, the more conservative you may be. Whereas you look at somebody like who maybe wants to do their wizards or their cats, they're materially invested in the VC investment they've had, and growing that through selling quantum cats or whatever bullshit they want to put on chain. And so they're materially invested in the changes that allow them to do more of that. So
he also made a great point of, do you want the biggest investors in Ethereum funding changes to the Bitcoin protocol? Because if you look at something...
Ripple, look what happened with Ripple.
Yeah. But even like, who are the VCs backing the people that are pushing, or at least certain people that are pushing current proposed changes, OpCat being one of them, right? No, you probably don't want the same people that were funding development of Ethereum having heavy influence over changes to Bitcoin. But he was making that in the broader context of, you should care who is funding and how it's being funded, which I also think is a different point, but right. Like there's perspective of being extremely conservative, which I think if you just step back and think about the fact that Bitcoin has had this much success, of it is in aggregate storing $1.5 trillion worth of purchasing power, and accepting the fact that that is a number that's so, even though there's a global financial system that's 400 trillion, 1.5 trillion is a number that's larger in actual value terms of what anybody could actually relate to in their individual lives. I mean, realistically, even a billionaire, of like, what would it be if I had 1,000 times more wealth? Like what that large of a number in itself demonstrates that Bitcoin has been massively successful. And in my opinion, it can support 100x plus more in adoption without changing anything. And if that's the case, then everything I think that would be contemplated as a change comes, with a trade-off of potentially upsetting that balance. And it's not to say that there aren't changes that could be particularly low risk that could further improve scaling. It's just that anything that you're changing needs to contemplate what's at stake, and that Bitcoin is not just massively successful. It really doesn't need to do anything different to support a bunch more adoption. And so, in that context and recognizing, just from where we are today, and it might be lost on some people, but like when you actually try to think about what $1 trillion is, and the fact that Bitcoin is storing 1.5 that, that's the magnitude of what you might potentially be screwing up by tweaking something and not understanding the ripple effects of how it's going to change all of the economic incentives.
Yeah, I'm personally become very conservative, ultra conservative, but I'm personally invested in the idea of Bitcoin as money as well. Not, I don't buy NFTs. I have no use. I don't like it. I know I can't stop what's happened now, but it brings me to this. Well, how do you even decide what happens now? Jeremy Rubin's been very keen on covenants. And do you know what? I understand the argument for covenants, and it's not a no. It's not like, but how do you get to that point now where things happen now? Are we essentially in a stalemate? And is a stalemate even a good thing?
I've always thought that when Bitcoin gets large enough and sufficiently decentralized, then it will just naturally ossify because changes can't happen.
Just can't get them through.
Just can't get them through because there's too many, the combination of two sides. There's too many people with competing views. And, you know, if you thought about, I need to get consensus of 5 people, or I need to get consensus of 100 people. But if it starts to be able to be, I need to get consensus of 100,000 people or 1 million, just accepting that the more people it is, getting the consensus of a overwhelming majority of a larger and larger number is more and more difficult to do. And then there's also a reality that is, well, what's the nature of the change? Because if just on its surface, it's going to be really hard, the more people that are involved to get a consensus, then there has to be a change with a nature that it could garner widespread support. And if there were, I don't want to say obvious things, because I'm personally someone that believes that there will be future changes to Bitcoin that particularly support scaling, you know, and that doesn't just necessarily mean non-custodial scaling, period. But how many of those ideas are there left? You know, how many of those changes that can actually improve Bitcoin by an orders of magnitude, particularly from the scaling side? That, you know, because if there are those, then I do think that would be something that would merit widespread support of, you know, an overwhelming majority of people that held Bitcoin and ran nodes and mined. But, you know, if you put those two things together, more people, harder to gain consensus, and just as Bitcoin evolves, it's just going to be natural that there's less opportunities to materially improve it.
It's a very different world in Bitcoin right now. So back in 2017 when I came in, or even 2013 when I bought my first Bitcoin, there was no Lightning Network at that point. And I don't know about you, but I tweet this often. My main use case for Bitcoin is I send Bitcoin, I receive Bitcoin, and I store Bitcoin. Okay, and I send using the base chain, I receive on the base chain, I send on the Lightning Network, I receive on the Lightning Network. I had my first little test of eCash, and my storage is a range of mobile custodial wallet to a Mutiny wallet to a single sig hardware wallet to a multi-sig. There's a range of things, but generally speaking, it falls into 3 buckets: send, receive, and store. And everything I need from Bitcoin, I've got at the moment, and I'm in the privileged position of being self-sovereign. I do like the idea of updates that come that increase the number of people who can still be self-sovereign. But it kind of does everything I need right now. But surrounding us is a lot of stuff going on. You know, we have ETFs, we have massive industrial scale miners who are now integrating their programs with AI programs. We've got presidents talking about self-custody. We've got an administration almost having a fight over wider crypto and Bitcoin itself. We have these huge ETFs that are sucking up a huge amount of Bitcoin. Like, the game theory's worked out, but there's loads going on. And it felt like perhaps post-block size war, everyone was kind of aligned of, okay, this is where we're going with Bitcoin. These are the important principles we need to keep. And now we seem to be back in a quite messy place. And so, like, what I really wanted to cover with you today is, like, what are, or if there are any, you might say there are none, but the kind of existential risks of Bitcoin, the things that we might have taken our eye off the ball with, it's important to just make sure we don't. It's important that we have, maintain these principles. And I'll just add to that, I've been messaging back and forth with Bitstein because he's raised the money to redesign the Nakamoto Institute website. And he said one of the important things in Bitcoin is to carry knowledge forward as people get tired, weary in Bitcoin, they leave. Like, how do we maintain these principles? So like, it's a big ramble there, but that's kind of what I want to like kind of veto Danny and say, like, this is what I want to cover with you today. You good with this?
Sure.
All right, big ramble first. Let's talk about ETFs. Not should they exist because they're inevitable. You can't stop them. They have sucked up a lot of Bitcoin. I don't actually know your views on ETFs, by the way, your general view.
They're going to exist. I look at them not a lot different to having your Bitcoin at a custodian. It's pooled Bitcoin. If people can achieve it, I certainly recommend that people hold their own keys and be sovereign over their Bitcoin, and that is what assures the greatest security. But from the ETF perspective, viewed it as, my personal opinion is that you better just hold it with a custodian rather than in an ETF, because an ETF is just adding, unnecessary layers of counterparty risk on top of the custodian that already exists. But there are also tools that are familiar to people. So just the fact that they were inevitable and they aren't very different from, just holding it with a custodian. And then also, when you think about it, it's like it's 1 million Bitcoin, right? I think total globally, but Grayscale, and I don't know how many Grayscale-like things existed before the US ETFs were approved. Now the Hong Kong ETFs were approved, but all of these ETFs are competing in an incremental 350,000 Bitcoin have gone in, and the price of Bitcoin has approximately doubled from there. And again, each kind of marginal buyer and marginal seller, it's like, I don't really think they're going to be able to accumulate more that would cause, or I don't think they'll be able to acquire a sufficient amount of Bitcoin to be a risk, because the same structure already exists. People can already buy Bitcoin with a custodian.
What would be a meaningful amount that would be a risk, and what is the risk?
I don't know, 20%, 20 to 40%.
Yeah.
I don't, something like that. I mean, I can't remember the amounts that were on Coinbase 5 or 6 years ago, but I believe it's more than there are today.
Okay.
And now there's the existence of more custodians, Fidelity, NYDIG. There's going to be more competing. I think the most important thing is that there's not concentration. So if there's a risk to the ETFs, is that all of the ETFs are using Coinbase, right? The more Bitcoin that is held with a single party, the more that party can influence, basically from a node level and from a rules perspective. But even then, Coinbase, with all of the ETF, Bitcoin has less than they had 5 or 6 years ago. So if Coinbase wasn't a risk at S2X, which they were certainly behind that New York agreement as well, and now Bitcoin is worth, it's like 50 times more. The more valuable Bitcoin becomes, the more people that hold it, the less any single economic actor can concentrate. Obviously Saylor's acquired 214,000 or whatever it is, but still over time, Bitcoin is held by more people in less nominal amount. So if somehow Coinbase had 5 million coins, again, that would start to get the level to be like, okay, if they wanted to force a change, not so that they could, but it starts to get to that level where they have basically the voting block of 5 million shares, whether or not that's legal or not, they run the node.
What about so you say economic actors, but some of these economic actors are political actors as well. I think the US certainly to some extent lives in a technocracy. We saw the influence that the likes of, or the blurred relationship between the big social media companies and the big search companies and the Biden administration. Could we end up with a weird kind of Bitcoin technocracy whereby there is a gray area between the large ETF issuers and the regulators?
I think inevitably, I don't want to cast it off as not a risk, because wherever you have large financial interests, then their ability to co-opt the legal system or then be co-opted by the regulatory system, it goes both ways,
Yeah.
right? They want something from the regulatory apparatus, they get something, and then they owe a favor back, right? So the same dynamic, I think, exists. It's just that, as a function of time, as more people understand Bitcoin, as more people adopt Bitcoin, I just kind of view it as this, the economic values like emanating from the center. It started off very consolidated, obviously, when it was a handful of developers, in 2009. But over time, the number of people participating grows, the number of powerful interests grow at the same time. But as a function of time and as a function of greater adoption, the currency is concentrated less and less. And so long as there's competing interests, where there might be large, powerful interests in the US, but there's large, powerful interests in Russia or in the UK or in Germany, that those act as checks and balances. So I don't believe, like, Bitcoin cannot be co-opted the way that a private social media company can be, right? Because no one is actually in control of the Bitcoin protocol like they are in control of an individual company. But it wouldn't be ridiculous to believe that the United States government could try to coerce the ETF holders to supporting certain actions or trying to get them to force certain changes onto Bitcoin. It just so happens that, not just so happens, my personal perspective on it is, look, if you could line up all the large companies in Bitcoin and all the large miners in 2017 when Bitcoin was worth about $15 billion, and now it's worth 1.5 trillion, if you couldn't co-opt the system then with those large interests, now that Bitcoin is that much larger and there's more at stake and there's more competing interests, it becomes harder and harder to believe it can be co-opted. So certainly individual actors can be, but as a whole, can it compromise the system? I personally don't think so. And I'm using heuristics of its scale today versus its scale of that last time that it was meaningful, like when there was a meaningful attempt to attack it, even if those people didn't view themselves as attacking Bitcoin.
I mean, there's been a meaningful attempt over the last 6 months, year, even the last couple of weeks, and it's been fascinating to see.
I don't even view that as like my perspective on that is it's annoying and it's loud.
Yeah,
I don't believe it's serious.
Okay.
In the sense of there's certain people that want to argue for the sake of arguing. They might even genuinely believe their idea is a good idea, but I don't think there's any
concerted effort.
I don't think there's not necessarily a concerted effort. I think that it's so small and narrow. It just seems like it's amplified and larger than it actually is. Because if I think about the major companies that are out there, like any of the miners, I don't know any miner that would be opinionated on, OpCTV, OpCat, others, whether or not Square is opinionated at River. I don't know what MicroStrategy's perspective is on it. I don't know what Coinbase is. Like, I don't see any large interests that are actually pushing for this. And what it is a handful of developers, and they might be well-meaning and they might actually be decent changes. But I don't view it as coming to that kind of industry level. Like, I personally think like there's no change that's getting done because the people that actually control the economic, like there's three main pieces: economic value and share, mining, and then people that run nodes, right? And the developers are a stakeholder, but they're not one of the most important three in my perspective, because if you create a fork of Bitcoin and Michael Saylor dumps 214,000 of whatever that fork is, its value declines rapidly. I would take these efforts or potential risks associated more seriously if there were large financial interests that were behind them, because that would signal that there's a more likelihood and an attempt to actually change something.
Which goes back to Michael Saylor's point. You want to be careful who you're accepting money from.
Or who's pushing the changes and what their incentives are, right? Like if someone's advancing a change because they want to bring a bunch of shit coins onto Bitcoin, that should, and I'm not saying that that's necessary. I'm just using it as an example.
But that is what is happening.
Yeah, that it would be very obvious, and that's also why I don't view it as credible, that the majority of Bitcoin holders who are here for storing their value into time would look at that and say, yeah, you can have your fun argument over there, but and think about it as like actual businesses that have real customers and are building real business models. Are any of them in support of the changes that are loudly being called for and being talked about as if we don't do this or that, it's an existential risk? I don't think it is. Now, that's not to say like I'm someone who probably agrees with someone that says, yeah, there's more that needs to be done. But I would be thinking about it as changes that specifically improve the scalability of Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I'd push back on, are there any businesses in that the block size wars was based on a number of businesses.
No, I'm saying that I'm contrasting.
Yeah.
Then it was Coinbase, Zappo, BitGo. According to somebody, 90% of all the miners, certainly, Bitmain, right? So then there were a bunch of large, and so like that was a credible threat because they were there. I'm saying now, can you name one large company? And now people will rumor that there's people, or not rumor, there will be people at Blockstream that talk positively about OpCat, but can you name 4 companies that want a change to Bitcoin and that are actively positioning to make that change happen? My answer to that question is no. If they're out there, I'd like to know about it, but there's just not nearly as large of a consensus, or like not even consensus, 2 competing views. There's I want to change and maybe I want to be very conservative, but there's not coalescing behind a particular change and 2 like really well-formed, for this and against it.
But where then, therefore, when do we consider something like a credible change that somebody wants? Because I'm
just saying if there were a bunch of stakeholders that were actively advocating for it beyond just developers.
Yeah, well,
like either large Bitcoin holders, like companies, because it's not just corporations. It's like there's got to be like you actually have to, and it's been one of the, as someone who's worked on Bitcoin custody, now working on Bitcoin payments, I know that there are people that are working on it. I just don't know, like when Taproot was put in, I don't know in like a live application. I know that there are, like I think River implemented it, but like one of the, it hasn't been like widespread, like it was adopted from a node level, but in terms of applications, it's still, and it was supposed to improve Bitcoin privacy because it would, just in terms of how certain transactions could be built, the on-chain footprint would make all, a number of transactions all look similar. But from a functional perspective, that was 4 years ago or so. And there's not a ton of applications that, if not for, that wouldn't exist if not for that change, that people could point to and say that was really positive. And at that time, there were a lot of people and a lot of businesses advocating for it. And I'm just not seeing this. What I'm saying is, in my personal experience and observation of what's happening, I'm not seeing a lot of people that are building important infrastructure out there saying, I could really use that.
The only thing I am seeing, I brought it up earlier, is governance. I am, in doing this, I'm talking to a lot of people who are very pro governance, pro Jeremy Rubin's CTV. I am seeing that, and what I'm seeing is that is a scaling solution that is good for users long term. not necessarily companies,
would
and not necessarily like big, large holders like that right now. Like Michael Saylor said, is like, we might not be able to have sovereignty for all. And
right, but imagine just, and again, I'm not someone who's just saying if you're not building a business, then your opinion is somehow less important. But what I'm saying is, if there's ideas being advocated by developers, then they only become a benefit to the network if application developers begin to leverage them, right? And so if there are good ideas, then there would also logically be existing pieces of infrastructure that would be advocating for them for the reason that they'd want to incorporate it. And if there's an absence of that, then maybe the perspective on what is a good change might just not be as important as you think it is.
So you're saying the momentum, widespread momentum, is a strong signal of what we need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it would signal that there is a change that a lot of people would actively want to build in, whether it's immediately, because even institutions can still be conservative, or applications can still be conservative of waiting to see once something is live, be tested in a live environment and not immediately jump. But at that same time, if there isn't that natural momentum, then that is a market signal in itself. And if I look at something like Opsy TV, and again, I'm not, this is something that I've thought about, hosted Jeremy at the old Unchained office for a PlebFi hackathon, events at the Commons, talked to a number of people. And it's like, to me, it seems like a good change, but it also seems marginal. And it's one that seems to improve base level security, rather than what I would necessarily think about how can more people achieve X, Y, or Z. And so like that is something in itself where it seems to be advocating for like, hey, there don't seem to be a lot of maybe perceived risks, but there also don't seem to be a lot of people that are out there saying, we really, like, as an application developer, I really need this, or if I had this, I would do it. And I've thought about it from the context of if I was still running Unchained, how would something like this be incorporated, or would it be from a custody perspective? And I kind of, on that one specifically, kind of come out at saying that this feels almost like a turtles all the way down problem of, well, what about the key that it's moved to? That's your security blanket, where, and that's not to say that there aren't other people that would use it. I'm just observing from my vantage point of saying, if there was widespread support for this, it would be apparent. And if there's not, then that is a great market signal. It should say, maybe put this one on the shelf for a bit.
And so are we therefore in that difficult position where kind of like developers want to build things? They just do. And if they can't, it can be frustrating for them because they're pushing against, it's like any other normal world. If it's just if it's the web or any kind of like centralized normal world, you can just build shit. There's no real impact. You're just building stuff, right? But here we're talking about what you say is the most important thing to work on right now, what is holding $1.5 trillion of value. And so... Well,
there's also a lot that can be built without changing Bitcoin too. And I think that is one of the things that I would recommend as an avenue, right? And I think Saylor talked about this as well, where it's like innovate, kind of went from layer, I don't know what he was describing as layer 4, 3, 2, 1, but that kind of, if you think about the application layer, what we're building at Zaprite, we're building on, with Lightning as a tool, on-chain as a tool, fiat as a tool. We don't have to change any of those things to deliver value, And so I don't even think that Fedimints required any changes to Bitcoin. Now, they might have come about based on prior changes, but there wasn't a change based on my understanding that was like, we need this change to enable Fedimints, right?
Yeah.
And so it might have been that the combination of SegWit with other changes that preceded it, then several years down the road, someone was like, let's build this on top of the tools that we already have. And so you can innovate and improve Bitcoin without changing it. And I do think that there's a tendency to want, like, there's a default position. Like, I think in Jameson Lopp has a great comment about how the default position in Bitcoin is no.
Yeah.
But the default position of developers working on an open source project is to change something. And those two things are in healthy conflict, not unhealthy conflict. That you want interests that want to be biased towards improving and changing, and you want interests that are biased towards conservatism and not changing. And that when those two cohorts, if they are only two cohorts, and of course they're not just two cohorts, if they coalesce behind something and agree on it, then you know that the reward trumps the risk in that scenario. But just accepting that there's market signals that if there's not momentum, there's probably not momentum for a reason, because people aren't out there just saying, like, I don't want to figure out new ways to improve Bitcoin or to build applications that I can't build today. Like, that's not a default position of the people that would also say be very conservative in changing Bitcoin, and that there's ways to improve Bitcoin at the application level. Like, opportunities are abundant to do that.
And do you think with that
like one example of this is sometimes people will do the math around Lightning.
Yeah.
And they'll say,
it's about what I was about to ask.
We can only do a certain number of transactions a year. So, people will be concerned about the fact that it's something like 70 million, or on the order of the magnitude. Maybe it's 140 million. I don't want to do the math right now, but they'll say, well, there's 8 billion people in the world, so they can't all transact on the main chain. And then they'll say, well, but there's 8 billion people in the world, so if you can only do 140 million transactions in a year, and to open a Lightning channel and close a Lightning channel is 2 on-chain transactions, you can only open and close 70 million Lightning channels in a year, and there's 8 billion people. It's insufficient. But it's like, there's not 8 billion people using Lightning today. There's massive opportunities to improve the usability of Lightning to onboard the next 10 million, 100 million people. And then Lightning as a tool, or Fediments as a tool, will become that much more valuable, and we'll probably learn something, having more capital both at stake as well as available to make other improvements. And so it's not this, you don't have to jump to the world where we have to go from where Bitcoin is today to supporting 8 billion people. It's recognizing that the actual improvements along the way, like, there's certainly enough capacity on chain to do all, like, anybody who wants to actually buy something on chain for enough value to justify the fees, or to open and close a Lightning channel, like, plenty of opportunities today, which means there's plenty of opportunities to improve it without needing to change Bitcoin. And that is, that's just something that people need to recognize and accept, while also saying, yeah, and if there's ways to put forward changes that will introduce material benefit to Bitcoin with marginal relative risk, then we should do that too.
Yeah, you preempted my little interjection. I was about to say, do you feel like we don't fully understand the role of Lightning yet? Its strengths, its weaknesses, how it's going to be used, and similar with Fedi, in that we're unlikely going to be in a world where you and I are going to have channels with each other. It's going to be centralized providers running the channels. But do we need to have this kind of acceptance that we're heading to a world when not everyone will be self-sovereign? We will have sound money, but we'll have a sound money base layer. And just, what people will then eventually have is distributed risk across multiple mints and multiple wallets. A bit like, how when you've got a treasury, your FDIC insurance is only 250,000, so people distribute their treasury across, their dirty fiat treasury across multiple banks and accounts. Is that the kind of risk that that's the distributed risk we're going to have, but with a sound money base?
That's a hard one to answer. So what I would say, where I'm opinionated, is that there's probably a world where not everyone's going to be sovereign over their money. And that I don't even think that, Saylor had the comment that, I think it was along the lines of, he said, I don't know that you can have both. And I don't know that you should be trying to have both, that sound money might be enough, and that if you try to solve for 8 billion people to be sovereign of their money, maybe you screw up the incentives of sound money. And I don't, when I heard him say that, I didn't hear him saying, you guys should all just be happy using custodians. That wasn't what I heard, but what I heard was somebody that was very deliberate in how they were kind of looking at the reality of the situation and saying, I'm not convinced that you can have both of these, and in this world, maybe sound money is enough. Now, my perspective on it is that a big way to improve self-sovereignty is improving the tools, right? So you don't necessarily have to change Bitcoin to drive down the costs of hardware wallets, or someone like Block and Square introducing BitKey, right? Which will make multi-sig more accessible to a wider range of people. I personally would still use Unchained, but there are other people that now it becomes available to based on the approach that they're taking, that it itself has trade-offs. Some people would say that's not a sovereign setup because there's two keys, one that sits on Block server and then one that's yours that also sits on their server, or you can back it up on I think Apple's iCloud. And that's not really the point. The point is it's a great solution, and it's going to work for a lot of people, and it's going to introduce a lot of people to the world of not just having their Bitcoin at a custodian. And so I don't think it's a trade-off where, like, I think it's a mistake to try to engineer Bitcoin to say Bitcoin, in order for it to be a success, needs to exist in a world where all 8 billion people in the world can be sovereign over their money. I think it's always something that is directional of being sovereign over your money, in my personal perspective, is what assures the greatest security over your Bitcoin. So there should be a general widespread interest that is not singular to people who already secure their Bitcoin with their own keys to make that both more accessible and to make Bitcoin capable of handling more of that. At the same time, as a direction, right? Like, if X number of people are able to self-custody today, we should want 10x, 100x the number of people to be able to do that. If you skip to the end of 8 billion people, you could seriously screw up some existing balance and incentive, and you don't need to. That it should be Bitcoin's working, it's working really well. Do we want a marginal incentive to be able to open this up to more people? Of course, but at what cost? So I think anytime that and it's the same analogy that I use with Lightning, when those people do the math of like, well, there can only be 70 million open and closes a year, and that can't certainly, solve the problem for 8 billion people. Therefore, Lightning has failed. Of course it hasn't. It's working beautifully for all the people that are using Lightning. And as more people use Lightning, then the tools to use it in a sovereign way improved. And there might be certain things about how payment flows work that it's naturally going to have, routers that have nothing to do with the architecture of Bitcoin. But point is that as a tool is used, it attracts more capital, and then that tool gets better and better. That's just the way that all technology advances, not limited to Bitcoin. And so I would just say that, to your immediate question, it's like, if you shoot for the endpoint of needing to solve for everybody rather than the directional, how do we open this avenue up to more people? I think you make a mistake.
Okay, I know I'm following you. It's the incremental learning along the way.
It's not just learning. Like, there might be a change, but if you're trying to engineer for something like, now there need to be 8 billion people, right? It starts to immediately fall back into the trap of the big blockers, which, a personal view, I believe it's both a true view as well as my personal view, that the scarcity of Bitcoin supply is tied to the scarcity of block space, because the scarcity of block space ensures that there will be a free market and ruthless competition for another piece of Bitcoin scarcity, being block space, which then ensures a fee market, which ensures there's always going to be miners there to secure the Bitcoin network, the validity of transactions, the integrity of its fixed supply. So if you start to say, well, there need to be 8 billion people that can all be self-sovereign over their money, that means that we need block sizes to be this big. And I'm using
but it's not what I'm saying, Parker. So sorry. Just what I'm not saying we need 8 billion people to be self-sovereign, but there is a likely trade-off of sovereignty versus hard money. What I'm actually getting at is the point is this shows to educate people and help them understand Bitcoin. And there are certain times, like recently with the rise in fees, there are certain people who could not do transactions on the base layer with Bitcoin they held because they've got little UTXOs. That's it. There's been some collateral damage. So there's a job to educate people in the right way. There's like a hurdle. Now some people will just leave their money on Coinbase and it doesn't affect them because they're just part of some giant UTXOs. But there will be people who want to be self-sovereign, and they at least need to understand what the future holds or potentially holds, and they need to understand topics like UTXO management, consolidation, and how they go between the base chain and the Lightning Network, and the potential costs they face in the future. Because as the fees grow, we will have collateral damage to people who have just unspendable UTXOs.
Where I was going at that was just I was drawing the analogy back to the block size, where to say like there is this inherent, I don't want to say conflict, but trade-off of everyone being sovereign and then not having good sound money. And that I think that's different than people needing to understand that how UTXOs actually work, and that if there's big fee spikes, if at all possible, just delay your transaction or be very cognizant. What I see frequently happen is that there's wallets that send to, they kind of like try to combine this Lightning and on-chain, and then people don't know that and they think they're sending Lightning and it's actually on-chain and they sent $30, but it was a $10 fee, right? All those things, people need to understand how Bitcoin works, and in order to be able to optimize how they use it. But at the same time, it's like today, last week I sent a transaction that on-chain was about 0.5% of a transaction fee. And it wasn't a particularly large, it wasn't small, but it wasn't a particularly large amount of value. And it was an actual transaction for commerce. If you think about that, and then also say, well, 90% of the transactions right now on the Bitcoin blockchain are a bunch of spam, that there's actually a lot of bandwidth relative to the actual amount of commerce that's happening on chain, that itself is not a big worry. But at the same time, be aware of it so that you're not sending a transaction when there's a particular fee spike, if you can avoid it. Like if you're sending to cold storage, can you delay that 6 hours till, later at night, or just putting a lower emphasis on what it's going to be included, or what block it's going to be included in, because all of those tools help people use Bitcoin better. But at its kind of functional layer of how much adoption there is today versus how much bandwidth there is, my personal perspective is that there's plenty, just based on the amounts that I'm paying for transactions, and I'm actually facilitating transactions in Bitcoin for real things in the real world.
Those spammers might not go away, by the way.
They will go away, but they will be replaced by
better economic transactions.
Economic transactions. So the point is that those fees will rise, and that's why my personal opinion, Bitcoin was never going to scale at the base layer. It always needed layers because the scarcity of block size, the scarcity of block space is tied to Bitcoin's ability to enforce a fixed supply.
What about like the use of Bitcoin and the spending of Bitcoin? Because at the moment, we still have a strong HODL narrative. ETFs certainly enforce that. That's not Bitcoin that's going to be sent or used for transactions. Most custody Bitcoin, cold storage Bitcoin won't be doing that. But at the same time, we've got a lot of people working hard at creating circular economies or ways to spend Bitcoin. Do you think it'd be good to have more of a focus on that? Do you think it's going at the pace it naturally should and will? And because we've still got dollars in our pockets and pounds in our pockets, we're going to get rid of them before the Bitcoin. Do you think about that much at all? Because if Bitcoin doesn't really become a currency, what is it?
I don't think that It's both of those things at once. It's going
Yeah.
exactly as it should be, organically. And with each passing day, more people should be focused on the transactional side of Bitcoin. But say again, like everybody has to be perfectly good with people are going to adopt Bitcoin payments as each individual. And my personal view is each business owner decides that they demand a better money, that the actual point of the shift is the business owner. So
Yeah.
the individual who wants to pay in Bitcoin is not as important as the business owner that's selling a good or service and is willing to accept it. And that my perspective on more people should be focused on the transactional side of Bitcoin is not dictated by the fact that, if we don't have a circular economy, therefore Bitcoin has failed. I know that the inevitable direction Bitcoin is going is that Bitcoin is going to facilitate 99.9% of all transactions, whether that's in our lifetime or beyond, don't know. But my motivation is dictated by what I see in the fragility of the legacy system. And that I believe that that system is a lot more fragile than I would have said 7 years ago before I got into Bitcoin.
We covered that in the last show we made. People should check that out.
Yeah, I think so. So it is more people should, because I think we have less time in terms of that legacy system holding up. And the more that's built before that really breaks down, at least in the US and in Europe and Japan with the three primary global reserve currencies, the better off everyone will be, but it will still be dictated by that individual business owner, taking that.
Yeah, and it points to the conversation we had before we started. We were talking about Zaprite. By the way, everyone check out Zaprite. It's very cool. Parker's working on it. In that, I have Bitcoin as part of every one of my businesses now. The football club, you can't buy tickets in advance, unfortunately, at the moment, but you can buy your burgers, beers, tickets on the day with Bitcoin. Sponsors can pay in Bitcoin. My bar, you can now pay in Bitcoin. My fund, you can donate in Bitcoin. My charity fund, I should say. My events business, you can buy your tickets in Bitcoin. Everything except Bitcoin. And originally, the first point of doing it was because we're selling to Bitcoiners, we should have it. Now I've gone through, I actually want it. And the reason I want it is that it's such a low percentage that I have, that we don't ever spend that Bitcoin. And so almost in every single case, it's just strengthened our business by having that Bitcoin. But I also have that protection now against the legacy system. If the legacy system collapses, my bar or cafe, all right, not everyone turning up is going to have Bitcoin and be able to use it. They maybe will have cash, but there will be people and it's going to grow. But what's that's done? That's made me demand the tools. And so previously we had the people who created the tools and there wasn't the customer. So maybe we've lost some good companies on the way. They were too early. But like I've got Zaprite now. I've set it up. I'm using it and I'm telling you, shit, I need this. I need that. And so I like totally agree with you. Now I as a business am using it. I know the tools I want and I'm creating the demand.
Yeah. And it's because you do key in on something where every entrepreneur itself is a speculator. We're going to go build these tools because we think that they're the right tools and we think that the time is right. But we need merchants like yourself to demand it, to then be the outlet to their customers. And at the same time, we need your input because there's kind of certain big ideas of what we think kind of that 90% through the fairway, what this needs to be, but then what you actually need in terms of the way that you interact with your customers then makes our input to our product better, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I think you also keyed in on a good point, which is that you have to think about it as I'm investing in the infrastructure. I'm creating a redundant rail. I'm reducing a risk to my business that exists because I'm either 100% committed to the fiat rails or I invest in this rail and give it as an option to my customer. And when you turn that on, as you've experienced with your business, it's going to be 2%, 3% of your business, right?
But it's growing.
But it's growing. So in a year or two, it might be 10%. And all of your customers will be trained that if they want to pay you in Bitcoin, they can. And then if that legacy system becomes more fragile, they know oh, okay, now I need to spend the Bitcoin. Because if 5% of people are spending Bitcoin with you, 100% of them could, because your customers are generally all people that are aware of Bitcoin, or maybe not 100%, but maybe it's 50. They're choosing not to. The tools have to exist first. The customer has to be trained that it's there and available. And the more businesses that choose to use the tool, the more powerful the software it gets. It's a very pro-cyclical or positive feedback system. If 10x the number of businesses start demanding Bitcoin payments, the tools, because the Bitcoin payments companies will have more money, the tools will get better, and they'll have more experience working with merchants saying, like, this is great, but I really need that too. And you look at it and you're like, oh, you know what? Those other 10 people are going to need that too, or those other 100 or the 1,000. So it is a very it's a positive feedback loop system, but it starts with that merchant like basically investing in their infrastructure to do so.
And it's a nod towards the Bitcoin companies. They've got a head start on the legacy companies now. And this is going to sound like an advert to Zaprite. By the way, check out Zaprite. It's fucking awesome. In that I'm going to be dumping QuickBooks for Zaprite. And the reason I'm dumping QuickBooks for Zaprite is that QuickBooks doesn't have a native way to accept Bitcoin. So the people who don't know, Zaprite is essentially what would you call it? A payment processor system. I can do my invoices.
Gateway.
Payment gateway.
We're a payment gateway. We don't process funds, but we support invoices, payment links, and e-commerce today. We hope to support things like point of sale in the future.
So the reason I've moved to Zaprite is that with QuickBooks is great. The software's great. It does a great job. I can manage my customers and my invoices, and I can send out invoices, and I can get paid. But it doesn't support Bitcoin. The problem I have that a lot of Bitcoin companies done is they've only solved the Bitcoin bit. Zaprite's done both. So when I do my invoices now, people can pay on their credit card, they can pay in Bitcoin, they can pay in their native currency. But it solved that problem. And I'm not dumping I wouldn't have dumped QuickBooks for Zaprite out of a favor. I'm dumping it because it's a better tool. It does the two of them. I look at my ticketing platform, TicketTailor. We've approached them and said, look, you need to accept Bitcoin. I've got customers wanting to buy tickets for events and conferences and football matches and Bitcoin. They said no. As soon as somebody comes along with a ticketing platform that does what you do, maybe you're going to add it. But as soon as somebody does a ticketing platform, I'm going to move to that as my ticketing platform because it does that merge between, it covers both fiat world and the Bitcoin world. And so I think it's like anyone who's running a company, it's just a nod to them. It's like, you've got a head start. But a lot of them have missed it, like OpenNode, right? OpenNode as a system is a great Bitcoin system. But in my football club, I'm using Zettle for card payments and cash. And then we have to go to OpenNode for Bitcoin payments. And then what we have to do is we have to write down all the Bitcoin payments and consolidate at the end of the day and update the inventory. That's annoying. I need the one that's got the two together, whereas paying with Bitcoin is just a button. Now, Zettle won't add it for us, and OpenNode don't support inventory. And that's the opportunity. It's that merger of the two. Yeah,
and that is something that when we think about helping more businesses, and it might seem paradoxical, but it's not. It's very logical that in order to get more businesses to accept Bitcoin, you actually need to have Bitcoin and Lightning. Like in my view too, is having on-chain is just as important as Lightning, that oftentimes people look past on-chain and then they just deliver a Lightning solution, but then someone like yourself might need to issue an invoice and that's not a Lightning transaction, right? But a key part of it is, in order to enable businesses to accept Bitcoin, you do need to seamlessly introduce the ways that they're already receiving fiat side by side with it. Because naturally, when someone starts to accept Bitcoin as payment, it's going to represent a small percentage. So if a business owner is thinking, do I accept this or do I not? It's not necessarily, in most cases, it's not because they don't want to accept it. In terms of the range of customers that are out there saying, evaluating to accept Bitcoin or not, it falls on the line of, this is going to make, I can't map this into my current business workflows easily. So therefore, I'm not going to do it. I'll just buy Bitcoin, right? And that's not saying there's also customers that are not even thinking about accepting Bitcoin. I'm talking about the ones that would actually contemplate it, and that the fiat rails being there seamlessly side by side and kind of one integrated experience that doesn't feel like, okay, if you want to pay fiat, go over here and do this. And if you want to pay Bitcoin now, come over to this place, that is part and parcel in our world of making it easier, like reducing the bar, both the mental cost to businesses, but also the practical implementation to say the bar is now low enough that you can accept Bitcoin as payment without having to disturb your other workflows. And in the future, we want to, like, as enough people get behind that as an idea, then there will be a world where we can take our payment workflows and just put them into a QuickBooks checkout so that you don't have to shift platforms. It's just right there for you. Or with Ticket Tailor to say, hey, just let us integrate Zaprite into Ticket Tailor, right?
We should contact Ticket Tailor.
Rather than us have to build a ticketing platform, because what we're delivering is this very seamless way for you to receive Bitcoin, Lightning, and Fiat all in one place. But while you're choosing your different ways that you're receiving Bitcoin, you can use Mutiny Wallet, Strike, Unchained, IBEX. We have Coin Corner enabled. You can also connect for Fiat, Stripe, and Square. That, like, we're basically saying you are already comfortable custodying Bitcoin a certain way and receiving Bitcoin a certain way. Same thing with Fiat. Let us just bring that into one interface, and that actually becomes a tool that wasn't there before. That then enables businesses to say, okay, with this at my hands now, I'll start to say yes. And I think that is important. Of, like, if there are people that are out there that are running businesses that are on the fence, it's like, hey, get off the fence, take the leap, because, you know, actually playing with the tools and evaluating them not only makes the tools better, but it also prepares your business in a way that you couldn't if you hadn't started to tinker with the tools or at least see what's out there.
Yeah, we should definitely contact Ticket Tailor.
Yeah.
They've integrated with Stripe. And so
the problem is that most people, because it is a problem that we understand Bitcoin very well. Right? We as a company, myself, you obviously as an individual, they look at it and they say,
why bother?
Why bother? So
yeah.
It might be that we need to orange pill the CEO first, because if I think one thing that's happened with Bitcoin payments is that expectations have not been set correctly, where they'll go to these companies and say, like, let's integrate Bitcoin payments and it's going to be gangbusters. And then they weren't prepared for, like, you actually have to invest in this as a strategy. And we're putting these tools out in the world for the first time. Growth is not just going to overnight be 10x. It's like businesses accepting Bitcoin as payment for the very first time, like in terms of, any business that's accepting it's doing for the first time. It's not the same thing as, like, let me get a new credit card processor, and they've already had an old credit card processor. Like, it's actually businesses doing this for the first time. If the adoption of Bitcoin is slow, if you think about helping somebody understand how Bitcoin works, then just think about the same processes for businesses accepting Bitcoin as payment.
Do you know what I would do if I was a VC? I would raise a fund to go and buy businesses that are really strong legacy businesses that have no Bitcoin strategy, add the Bitcoin in, and that's like a cheat code for growth. Because I would buy Ticket Tailor, for example, and I would add Bitcoin in, and I know every Bitcoiner who is running an event or selling tickets, this is the platform they're going to use. And so we've got that advantage already. First in the market, understands Bitcoin. So as you know, we see this go from 1% to 2% to 5%. You're in the lead, but anyway, I'm not a VC.
No, but I think a key thing is that the person running Ticket Tailor in that example, they actually need to understand it, because you can't craft a strategy around Bitcoin if you don't understand it.
Of course.
So the same way would be if you went to Ticket Tailor and were like, hey, integrate Bitcoin, and then your growth is going to increase by 10x, 100x, but they don't actually understand Bitcoin. They're the ones that actually have to affect the strategy, to know what tools to build, to how to market it to the businesses, and also to be okay being early. And so it really starts, and that's also why from our product, we're really going for the people that want the Bitcoin, because we know that those are the people that are going to give us the best feedback, and that will guide building the right product, which will then result in the next wave of 10x, 100x people adopting it. But it's a complex problem. But at the end of the day, there's no other way, like, through this. Like, you got to go through. There's no going around the storm. And so, realistically, and again, all of it's born from my perspective, not from this, we have to have a circular economy for the point of having a circular economy, because that honestly is a trope that annoys me personally. It's that realize that not only is there a lot at stake in Bitcoin and that it's worth 1.5 trillion and we should be conservative in how we change it, but the reason why it exists is because this legacy system is broken.
Yep.
And the more nodes that we have connected to Bitcoin, not actual Bitcoin node, but like businesses that are accepting it, the less pain we're all going to have to suffer when that house of cards really comes crashing down. And if you're just observing the craziness that's going on broadly in the world, but really in the economic system, it's not good out there.
Well, that's why I'm so focused on my town of Bedford. If there is that crash, when that crash happens, I know my businesses are fine because they've got Bitcoin, they can accept Bitcoin, and we've orange pilled a few businesses and they'll be fine. And so if we orange pill that to town, I feel like that town is going to be marginally protected from a current situation. So, no, I agree with you. How much are you thinking about the regulatory environment right now? We've got Mr. Donald Trump this week. I know we can't trust any politicians and they're full of shit. But fucking, if I was American, he'll get my vote for Ross Ulbricht alone. But there has been this concerted effort from Elizabeth Warren and her goons, as he said, to attack Bitcoin, attack the principles of Bitcoin. We've had great work by the likes of Cynthia Lammers, who's been out there speaking the language of Bitcoiners in Congress. For whatever reason he's doing it, whatever the interest is, the fact that he's come, well, actually, let's say what it is. I mean, how long have you been in Bitcoin? It's fucking insane that like Bitcoin, I know I have to say crypto now, but that is now a part of the ballot. That's part of the vote. It's now out there. It's on the record. But how much do you think about this? Because some people like just ignore the politicians, we'll build around them. But there has been a strong effort to attack Bitcoin miners, the energy part, energy neutrality, self-custody. It's existed. And strangely, the fight back is now internal in politics. I mean, I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah. And I think that I do think, from the perspective of the thing that concerns me is politicians will flip constantly.
Of course.
Right? Now, as it relates to Ross Ulbricht, I do believe that if Trump gets elected, that Ross will be freed. And I think on that alone would be worth, considering, a vote. Mm-hmm. But I think it's certainly relevant that now at least they perceive there to be a large enough voting bloc that they don't want to be perceived as being against it. Mm-hmm. So I think that more says something to Bitcoin and its size. But don't think for a second that he gets elected and then the deep state that exists says, oh, this Bitcoin thing's a problem. You can release Ross Ulbricht. We don't really care about that. And I think that's probably why he, went out with Ross rather than, making others. Yeah, exactly. Assange or Snowden. But when it comes to Bitcoin, he's looking for some cheap votes, right? And so, yes, it's a size of its scale, and it's a size of its scale, and a sign that they're worried about pissing off a large voter bloc. I think the negative of it is that it's continuing to further this conflation between Bitcoin and everything else, mm-hmm. and that I'm less worried about what happens in this next election, and realistically, what happens in the end, and that if Bitcoin purposely gets lumped with a lot of snake oil, that then when the snake oil proves to be snake oil, then they associate it with Bitcoin and they say, you know what? In order to protect you, because it turned out there was a lot of snake oil there, we're going to need to heavily regulate this for your own good. Yeah. And so
rocket ETF.
Yeah. I would just caution the political bandwagoning, and just accept they don't know shit about Bitcoin. Yes, it's good that it's become an issue that's large enough that they're trying to pander, but that's what they're doing, pandering. And if all that we get out of it is Ross walking free, then it will have been worth it in this case. But you still don't want to be associated with snake oil salesmen.
I had Matt Corallo on the show recently, and he thinks minor centralization is an existential risk to Bitcoin and will be over the next 5 years. And there's been little meaningful progress in the adoption of Stratum V2. And like when Matt Corallo talks and says something like that, I stand up, I listen. But when he's saying it, there still isn't a huge amount of debate. An interview goes out with Saylor, and Saylor talks about how developers should be funded. And everyone's talking about it for a couple of days, but we haven't. I feel like that's a bigger topic of conversation, more important topic of conversation. How much have you thought about this?
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I didn't listen to that podcast with Matt, but I did listen to one that he recorded with Marty a couple weeks ago.
It's probably the same topic then.
And I think if something is true, it's that mining still remains the source of greatest centralization within Bitcoin, and that decentralization is a word that people throw around a lot. And certainly, like, I have a massive amount of respect for Matt. So whenever Matt signals an alarm, I'm similarly paying attention. And so when we think about mining centralization, it's at the chip level. The thing that came out most recently was that there are 4 or 5 pools, maybe more, that are all
ANT pool.
Essentially ANT pool. Mm-hmm. And so if pools were all already perceived to be centralized, then they're more centralized than previously perceived. At that same time, mining is more centralized than it has been in the past. And I'm someone who believes that the economic incentives will dictate competition and decentralization without needing to change something. Now, that doesn't mean what needs to be done to incentivize more pools. And this is something that I've started to think about, don't have a great answer. So I'm not, just saying like, hey, if there's this much competition, why are there only 10 pools? Right. And what a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from people in the mining space is pools are bad businesses. And it's like, well, but they're necessary parts. Maybe they're not supposed to be businesses. Maybe they're just supposed to be cost centers of businesses. Like Marathon runs its own pool, right? And so it's a large miner and runs its own pool. Maybe that is the answer of, more miners running their own pools and just realizing that it's a cost center and they don't want to be, censored. And just as a Bitcoiner who's holding their own keys doesn't want to be censored by a custodian, maybe a Bitcoin miner shouldn't, perceive the risk of being censored by a pool.
But you got to be a miner of a certain size to justify your own pool. That's why pools exist.
Yeah, but there could also be, co-ops where it's just a cost center. It's not a business. It's not a business in itself. Where it's like, hey, let's share the cost of this infrastructure and allocate it as we need to. But my point is that, like, one of the things that Max suggested on the TFTC podcast, I don't know if he suggested the same, was like, changing proof of work. Did he talk about that? Yeah, like that is something that I would be like, like off the table. Like that would get into the thing that Saylor was talking about, where it's like, wait, overnight you just took away people's private property rights. Like, who are you ever going to convince in the future to come and secure your network? So like,
but I laugh at the trigger threat.
I know, but like, but also he's part serious about it, right? And it's another signal to say, like, you haven't thought this all the way through. Like, then what are you going to do? You're going to have to start to say, well, we're going to do this change, but it's going to be in 6 years. So you guys start to prepare. You're still impairing people's businesses.
Of course.
And if centralization is a problem, then figure out like all the incentives that exist in the world to, and when I say all the incentives exist in the world, if Bitcoin, I don't know what the current mining reward is, but last year was something around the order of magnitude of $20 billion. As Bitcoin grows in terms of the aggregate, those are real economic incentives that should drive people to better solutions. And just because a better solution hasn't arisen doesn't mean it's like, hey, go build a pool. You know, like if pool centralization is a problem, go raise some money and build another pool.
But maybe
Because that itself would contribute to a solution without changing Bitcoin, which should always be the default. And from what I see, because chips are decidedly more centralized than pools, right? And that too is being taken care of, albeit slowly. It's hard to develop a new chip. Intel's been working on one for a long time. As Bitcoin grows, the economic incentive grows, and therefore, I think it's WhatsMiner has started credibly competing with Bitmain. A third will be introduced that will credibly compete. That sometimes you just have to let the economic incentives have enough time to take over. And where Matt's focused on in terms of pools, it's like the chips are more centralized, and the good thing is there's something like 600 exahashes of Bitcoin mining that is securing the Bitcoin network. And in 2017, it was 5 exahashes. So the aggregate amount of power and the aggregate amount of efficiency of machines continues to improve, and Bitcoin's getting more and more secure. And there's massive amounts of money at stake of all of these pools that are in the business of Bitcoin. So like there's enough money at stake that no one has an interest to undermine the viability of Bitcoin.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is the economic incentives don't seem to exist for people to create these competing pools. And,
well, no, they do.
Well, I'm not sure. If you look at proof of stake, the economic incentive is to centralize. Maybe the economic incentives around pools is to centralize because of the driving down of the costs, because they're competing essentially with each other on the payouts. And so that's why there's like maybe a tendency to centralize. Maybe this is one of the things where it's more than just economic incentives. Maybe it's like something we raise as Bitcoiners to say, look, maybe it's one where we have to get all the big miners together and say, look, you all need to adopt Stratum V2. This is important for Bitcoin. It's important for you. It's important for the future. And then once it's done, it's done. And then we can forget about it. Maybe it's something we need to be noisy about.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, let's do
it. where somebody could go to someone like Riot and say, hey, you should really be running your own pool, right? Yeah. Or someone could go out and build another pool and I haven't read it yet, but just flagging it for the listeners. Steve Barber has a idea. You should maybe have him come on and talk about this. I think he calls it the mother pool. But basically, like the idea is, I think the idea is as a co-op of, but ultimately saying that there are orders of magnitude more mining operations, entities that are mining than there are pools. And the pools are they're necessary pieces of infrastructure to propose, like to construct block templates to then send out to miners. And even if you weren't using a pool, but you were a pool yourself, you still have to do that. So I really think it's a combination of, articulating it for large miners, because if they're solo mining, they can use Stratum V2 and they're just proposing their own blocks anyways. But also, like, part of it is going out and talking about the importance of it. The other part of it is like, just as I'm going out and working on Bitcoin payments, the logical thing for an entrepreneur to be like, hey, if this is a necessary piece of infrastructure for every pool that exists, and if there's massive consolidation around a pool in China and there's a bunch of miners in Texas, like, maybe I could just go win their business by delivering as good or better a service and, be with a relationship that they actually know and understand. That there's financial risk, right? One of the reasons why, like, Poolin, I think, has been functionally absorbed. I mean, I think they're still their own entity, but they filed for bankruptcy. But they were one of those pools that was lumped in.
Which
with
one?
Poolin.
Oh yeah.
They're one that's using Antpool's block template, but there's this broken economic model, which is FPPS, which is basically paying out to your customers in a predictable way when you have unpredictability natural to your business. It's just, it's a bad business model. The biggest in that has been able to consolidate, because if you have a lot of money, you can withstand a lot more volatility or uncertainty. Right. But it doesn't change that it's just a cost center to miners, and it's a necessary one. So where there is, if there's consolidation, it's like, hey, just go make a better one, and that's not, just as easy said than done, but it's just as easy as creating any other business. Like, it's still hard. And there's an economic incentive out there. So like, if there's an incentive to decentralize mining chips, and which is a hyper centralized industry as a whole, then like the specialty of running a pool there's not great barriers to entry there. So I recognize that centralization anywhere in Bitcoin is important to root out, and that decentralization is not trivial, and that we should focus on it. It's just like, it's basically a non-starter when you start talking about changing the protocol. Yeah. It's like I almost don't want to say it because it's a red line. It's a red line, and it's also just a worse solution than figuring out how to run a better pool.
It did make me laugh though. How important do you think culture is in Bitcoin and competing cultures? I'm thinking a lot about what Bitstein said to me earlier, where he said about it's important to pass the knowledge down that people have learned, because people get tired in Bitcoin. 8 years is a long time. I'm even feeling it. I'm like, I'm done soon. You want to go and do other things. Also, your personal economic incentives might change with that 8 years. You're like, I don't need to do this. I don't need to get on a plane every 8 weeks and travel the world and do 20 interviews. I can stay at home now and be with my family. And so that there is always a new guard replacing an old guard, and ensuring that the key principles are maintained. But how important do you think culture is? Because Bitcoin culture is definitely changing.
I don't think so.
All right, there's competing cultures now.
Yeah, and they're always. But I would. Okay.
Yeah,
I've been around since 2016, so there was a wave of it before myself. But I just naturally, we could associate it with having some culture, but there inevitably were competing cultures because there were people who were pushing Segwit 2x, and so I think that there are always going to be competing cultures. Like, whatever the term is that we're using is important culture, in sense of like the way maybe I would describe it is that the social layer of Bitcoin is important to its integrity and security, and that technically, I think the right way to think about Bitcoin security is it's certainly not static. Nothing is is given. Everything's always at risk. The longer that Bitcoin survives, the larger that it gets, the more secure it is, just because it naturally becomes more decentralized, even if that path to decentralization is not linear. It doesn't mean, like, if it's decentralizing over time, it doesn't mean that there can't be patches where it becomes marginally more centralized. But as a directional trend from like Satoshi to Hal to then the rest of the world, more people are owning Bitcoin. There's more miners. There's more people building hardware wallets. There's more financial custody, financial services. There's more payments companies. That just naturally happens. That as it comes to the social layer, the culture, that it has proven to be important to protect Bitcoin in the past, and that you can't really know how secure Bitcoin is until Bitcoin's been attacked and immunizes the threat. And so I think that until Bitcoin's at a point where it's the global reserve currency and it's used as the unit of count, we probably don't need to worry about culture. But until then, I think the social layer of Bitcoin being there as a check and balance to prevent changes to Bitcoin that could be harmful are very important. It certainly was the case with Segwit 2x. Now, in that case, it was a group of developers that put together a solution that was better than, a competing solution that the large corporate industry were putting together. But there were also a lot of voices out there that were speaking truth to power. speaking truth to the large corporate interests. And some of those corporate interests later admitted that they were wrong and they understood why. Wences and Zappo, and certainly one of them. I think there's a lot of them that never said that they were wrong. Someone like, Roger Ver's never said that he was wrong, and so
because he still thinks he's right. There's a difference between those.
Have you ever seen the Seinfeld where he says, if you believe the lie, it's not a lie. It's still a lie.
What I'm saying is he's still in the camp. He's still in that fight. It's over, but he's still in it thinking it's
but maybe he's just a scammer.
Yeah.
Maybe he knows it, and maybe he has an economic incentive or an egotistical incentive to try to save face.
Maybe, but I genuinely believe he still thinks that he was right. You would have to have so little self-awareness and acceptance of the economic majority, the overwhelming majority disagreed, and consensus defines what Bitcoin is. It could be a reality. Oh, yeah.
There could be a reality that he fundamentally misunderstood everything about Bitcoin.
Yeah. But
from inception. But my point is that that the social layer of Bitcoin continues to protect it, because when that guy comes out with whatever his book is called, how Bitcoin is, it's that people are like, no, that guy's still a scammer, and so, don't read, not necessarily don't read it, but take everything in that book with a grain of salt, because this is the history of that person.
I think he believes he's right, but I also think at a time right now whereby there are these questions of sovereignty versus sound money, and questions about in the future will everyone be sovereign. He will be thinking, this is what I was saying. I was right. I'm not saying he's right, but I genuinely think he thinks he's right. I think Eric Voorhees knows it was wrong, but doesn't apologize because he doesn't think he should apologize.
But he's still, Eric Voorhees is another example. He's still been selling shit coins.
Oh, yeah. But on Bitcoin, I think he knows that. But he won't, I don't answer for him. I'll see him this week. But I think he thinks he doesn't have to apologize, because at the time he thought he was doing the right thing. Wences said, sorry, others have just kept quiet. I just say on Roger, I still think he thinks he's right.
But this is the thing. Wences didn't just say he's sorry. He explained why he was wrong.
Yeah.
Which demonstrated his own understanding of Bitcoin. And that is what it is. I'm using it as an example to say there was a social layer of Bitcoin that protected Bitcoin, and that the social layer of Bitcoin remains important, and calls, I wouldn't even say it's culture, right? Because Saylor can have a competing culture with other people, and it's not just two, it's tons, right? A strong social layer being the voice of reason to say, don't come and change Bitcoin, or if you do, learn from the, mistakes or successes of the past, that is very important. And that,
do you think that social layer will naturally form and do what it needs to do?
Yes.
Or do you think it needs active work to maintain principles?
I think there's enough.
Is that incentives again?
There's enough money at stake. There's enough time at stake, and there's enough people that care very seriously, both on an individual level about Bitcoin, as well as potentially from a higher purpose, in terms of saying if you think about somebody that's invested 8 years of their life, that part of it is money, part of it is time, that they are invested, that if there are changes put forward to Bitcoin or threats to Bitcoin, because they're not all internal, that there's an important role to play for the social layer to protect it against, if it was Marathon several years ago basically forking Bitcoin Core and, running a censor scheme, or somebody putting together a bit proposal and then instigating for a questionable activation process. But it could also be the US government trying to do something to Bitcoin to restrict its use. In all of those cases, I believe that the incentives are great enough, combining money at stake with time and give a shit factor to activate when it actually becomes a real, tangible, present threat.
That's why I love talking to you. I always learn so much. You always come around these topics. A bit like Harry Suddock does it very well as well. Sudoc, sorry. You come around and you have a different way of looking at it. I'm not as smart as you, so I can't do that. What do you think about them? Is there anything like that does worry you? Anything where you're like, that one I'm not sure the economic incentives are strong enough or the will is strong enough?
I think that if there's a risk to Bitcoin,
yeah.
I will say this. There's two things. I don't think that there's a technological silver bullet that is going to cause Bitcoin to fail. So there's not like a quantum computer out there that would cause Bitcoin to fail. There's not something in the mining chips that would cause Bitcoin to fail. There's sufficient decentralization and sufficient redundancy, and that Bitcoin has achieved a level of scale that is hard for some technical breakdown to create a risk for Bitcoin. And so then I would put that there's two risks that are the social layer, or that's supposed to stem from the social layer. One of them being a state level attack, not on the mining side, but more on the censorship side. And that until that happens in earnest, and hopefully it never does, but
we should be guarded.
We should be guarded that if a state actor like the United States said, if you mine a transaction originating from these addresses, we will pursue you with, the full weight of the U.S. government. Will prosecute you under the Espionage Act or whatever, whichever act they choose to prosecute. If the U.S. government was powerful enough to prevent those addresses from being included in blocks, period, like if a Bitcoin transaction could be censored, then that would establish that Bitcoin is not sufficiently decentralized. Mm-hmm. And that's, one of the reasons that, someone like Matt Corral is concerned is because there's a relationship between the centralization of pools that they might not do something out of their own positive incentive. They might do something out of their own negative incentive, So if pools are a risk, it might not be a risk because they're going to commandeer Bitcoin and change it. That, I believe, that ship has sailed. But if there's 9 pools and the U.S. government goes to each of them and says, yeah, you're not going to mine any transaction that we say is not valid, like that is a threat to Bitcoin, because it was established that Bitcoin is not sufficiently decentralized to be resistant to censorship. So that's one of them, and being conscious of it. And that if there was a attempt at that, like OFAC has put together a list. They haven't gone so far as to say any miner in the world that includes or builds off this is guilty. That would be another level. The next thing is, I do think, and again, it's not in a antagonistic way, but changes to Bitcoin are outside a state censorship, which it wouldn't be for the censorship in itself, but the fact that you open up this Pandora's box, that the rules that define Bitcoin are not the sole thing that's determining what is and isn't a Bitcoin on that side, that changes to Bitcoin that are voluntary become, whether the next greatest, the most logical thing to cause some existential problem that wasn't foreseen, just because it's introducing change. And it's not to say that advancements to Bitcoin shouldn't be pursued at the consensus level or at the protocol level. It's just to be recognizing that same thing that we talked about at the start, is that Bitcoin has achieved a massive amount of success. And it really has done so because it is so difficult to change. If you think about it at its core, the 21 million fixed supply, Bitcoin is valuable because it's fixed supply of 21 million and it's resistant to all forms of censorship. Those two things are related to each other. You can access the network permissionlessly. But if you think about like the importance of a fixed supply, it really is of no good if you can be censored and not be able to access it. And part of that, though, coming back to the conversation about changes to Bitcoin, is if you accept that Bitcoin's valuable because of its fixed supply, part and parcel to that is that it's difficult to change. So any change to Bitcoin presents a risk, and then the question is what benefit at what cost? Do we get that from, or do we take that benefit, knowing that or do we take the risk knowing that there's a benefit? And so it's just that reality that I don't think that if the majority of economic actors knew what would have happened with all of the spam, would those changes have been made, right? And maybe some good comes out of it in the end, and it turns out to be a great decision. And in this case of the combination of SegWit and Taproot, it's like there's not going to be an economic incentive that allows for JPEGs on the blockchain and the affinity scam that is ordinals to persist in the future. There will be others, but it's just it's a one-time transfer of funds, and it will die out over time. That is what it is, but it's just accepting that we all then learn from that past, and there just are unintended consequences of changes. And so if there's a risk, it's state censorship and changes to Bitcoin that upset a very intricate combination of balance of powers and balance of economic incentives. I don't know if you remember, I bet you do, but Adam Back gave he was doing a podcast, I don't know how long ago, it was probably like 5 years ago or so, where he was talking about when he endeavored to figure out ways to improve Bitcoin. And he realized that the design space was, or at least in his own view, was so limited to improve Bitcoin because anything that you improved on one side would make it worse somewhere else. And that guy's a lot smarter than I am.
Yeah.
Right. But his first instinct, not first, but this was, I think he was describing himself in like 2014, 2015, or maybe earlier than that, saying like he spent 2 years trying to figure out all the different ways to improve Bitcoin, and realize there's not a lot of ways to improve Bitcoin without making it worse somewhere else. Everything's a trade-off. And so if someone like Adam Back comes to that conclusion, it's like you're kind of operating within a straitjacket. Yeah, we can do certain things, but just know that there's something very great at risk by changing it.
Brilliant. Is there anything we've not covered you wish we had?
My book.
Yes.
We don't need to cover it, but just tell people to go buy it.
Yeah, gradually, then suddenly go buy the book. Did you sell all the artwork?
We've got a limited edition of 21. I sold 6 as part of my crowdfund. Okay. So we got to figure out how we're going to sell the other 15.
Okay. How much are they?
That I got to figure out.
Okay. I might get one. And also, we didn't mention Zaprite. Maybe we should.
Yeah, we did.
I'm joking. Big shout out to Zaprite. Go check it out. I absolutely love the product, and Park hasn't paid me for this, but definitely go and check it out. It's a fucking amazing product.
I appreciate you saying that.
No, I do. I like, if I use something, I want people to use it. It's really good. So well done with that. And I guess I'm going to see you at the Commons on probably after the show. Well, the show will come out after that, but I'm going to see you at the Commons Thursday.
Yeah.
Thursday, Kathy Wood.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Parker. See you all later.
Thanks for having me on.